Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today we're welcoming Dorcas Chang-Tozun to the show. Dorcas is an award-winning writer, editor, speaker, communications consultant, and former Inc.com columnist. She is the author of multiple books, including what we'll be talking about today, Social Justice for the Sensitive Soul, How to Change the World in Quiet Ways. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Christianity Today, Image Journal, and dozens of other publications in the United States, Asia, and Africa. She serves as the editorial director of PAX, a Christian nonprofit dedicated to inspiring and equipping the next generation of BIPOC contemplative activists, and is a high school instructor of social innovation at Valley Christian Schools. Dorcas has nearly 20 years of experience as a nonprofit and social enterprise professional. She served as the first director of communications for d.light, one of the world's leading social enterprises, and has provided communications consulting for social benefit companies around the world. She and her entrepreneur husband have been married for 18 years and have 2 young sons. Let's welcome Dorcas to the show. All right, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Lauren Richmond Jr., and today we are welcoming Dorcas Chang-Tozun to the show. Hey, and thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, looking forward to this conversation. Been looking forward to it for a while. Anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you?
Well, aside from being an author, I also have 2 other jobs. Well, maybe 3 if you count being a mom as well. So I'm a mom to 2 young boys. They're 6 and 11. And then I also am an editorial director for a Christian nonprofit called PAX. And I teach a high school class on innovation for social impact.
That sounds interesting. That's cool. Thanks for sharing that.
Of course.
Talk about your kind of faith journey, if you would, kind of what that looked like for you, the beginning of your story and what that looks like today.
Yeah, so I am, I believe, 4th or 5th generation Christian on both sides of my family, which is a little bit unusual in that my parents immigrated to the U.S. Shortly before I was born. And so it was actually my great-grandparents, or in a couple of cases, my great-great-grandparents, who converted to Christianity through missionaries who came to China. So it's really interesting that sort of legacy of those long ago missionaries still continues today in my family and many other families that I know. But I would say for me personally, you know, I have certainly been a Christian my entire life, have been to church my entire life. And I would also say that I have probably lived 3 different versions of faith through my life. So I grew up in a Chinese immigrant church, which was very loving, but also kind of your typical, you know, very conservative, very fundamentalist church, very focused on personal salvation, individual relationship with God. And so it was all about making sure that you pray and go to church and read your Bible and check all those boxes, and then you'll be okay with God and you'll get your ticket into heaven.
Yeah.
Then in college and, you know, young adulthood, I did the whole deconstruction thing, which many people do in that age. And I then became very passionate about social justice and discovered, fortunately, you know, had some great experiences at conferences and with certain leaders and authors, and recognize that justice is a huge theme in the Bible, and that God cares deeply about not just our individual salvation, but our well-being, our physical well-being, our emotional well-being, and not just that of the church, but of the entire world. And so became very passionate about being involved in social issues. And then I burned out really, really badly multiple times, which we'll probably talk about later. I talk about it in the book as well, and realized, wait, this, like, I'm all in on social activism and I'm 100% laying down my life 24/7 for these causes. Something about this isn't quite working either. And so since then, I would say, maybe in the last 10 years or so, I've been slowly finding my way back to a more balanced approach to faith, which I think is ultimately what Jesus calls us to. This balance of communing with God, taking the time to be quiet and to be reflective and to pray, but also being active and engaged with the needs that we see around us.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Share, if you would, just some spiritual practices maybe that have supported you or sustained you.
Yeah, I think in recent years, I am very fortunate in my work at PAX to work with a couple of colleagues who are pastors and who very much have a contemplative bent to the way they approach spirituality. And that is not something that I was ever exposed to when I was younger. And so I've learned a lot from my colleagues, and a couple of practices that I have adopted from them that have been really helpful for me. One is breath prayers. I think I grew up in a church tradition, and I'm sure many of us did, where, like, the longer the prayer, the better. There was sort of this tacit assumption of the more words that come out of your mouth, right? The more holy and sacred your prayer is.
Lord God, Father, Holy, right?
Exactly, yes. And so to embrace these very simple yet heartfelt prayers, and to pray with my spirit, but also my breath and my body, it's been a I don't know. It has just felt like a more holistic experience of what it is to connect with God. And another practice that I do sometimes and should probably do more is loving kindness prayers. I think especially in times when I am feeling upset, angry, frustrated at the state of the world. I see terrible things in the news. It has been helpful grounding for me to practice praying goodness and kindness and grace and mercy and love, even for people who really, really frustrate me and who I don't agree with. But ultimately, again, that is what we are called to as Christians. And so it's been helpful for the health of my own soul and for my ability to stay connected to the humanity of other people.
Yeah, it's a lot harder to be angry or hold even hatred or feelings of hate, I feel like, in my heart, if I'm praying for somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think is a big reason why God asked us to do that.
Yeah. Well, let's jump in. I had Dorcas on to talk about her book, Social Justice for the Sensitive Soul, How to Change the World in Quiet Places, How to Change the World in Quiet Ways. A book I read, I don't know, it's been a while since I read it, but I frankly loved it and was really excited to have this conversation. So I kind of want to start off this conversation just from sharing an experience of my own. So this was probably about 2 or 3 years ago, right? Kind of in the height of COVID, probably like that first summer when obviously there was a lot of, or fall, because I think during the summer was really the George Floyd tragedy, and then the protest, and then obviously there was a lot of energy around protests and social justice for good reason, of course. But I had this experience where there's like a social, there's some kind of like social welfare group. I can't remember the exact who they were. We're hosting some kind of protest or march against this. There's like this property in my city that's been poorly managed by the owner, and just kind of an environmental hazard, economic drain on the part of town, and the owner really hadn't wanted to do anything with it. So this group was organizing this march, and through my church, we were kind of promoting it to participate. So I went, and my wife was working, so I took my kids, who were, I think, like 6 and 2 or 7 and 3, something like that at the time. Yeah. So, we went, and I remember, like, my daughter, like, they're doing like the blowhorn and the cheers and the chant. And of course, my daughter, who was 6 or 7 at the time, was like, hated it. So we were hanging way back. And then, like, we got there, and, like, there's just this scenario that went down that could have gone really sideways. Like, I was hanging back because of my kids, but there's a scenario that happened where, from my perspective at least, like, the march leader, like, really became, I think, inappropriate towards one of the property representatives. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this could have gone really sideways really quick. And frankly, like, the property representative was more level-headed than I would have been probably in that situation. And I was just like, oh my goodness, like, I don't know if this is the right context for me, for my kids. So I know in the book you kind of share similar, I don't know if experiences, but kind of similar feelings. So maybe talk about kind of what kind of led to writing the book in similar stories.
Yes, absolutely. So I can totally relate to what you just shared. I have taken my kids to a couple of protests, and it's always this hard choice of, I think there's absolutely a time and a place for protests. I think there are ways to protest that are extremely effective. I did choose to bring my kids to protests because I want them to have that exposure. I want them to understand that there are things that happen in the world where it is so egregious that even when it's hard for us, it's important to show up. Yeah. It's important to, be part of the voices calling for change or for justice.
Right.
At the same time, I think it did always feel uncomfortable for me. So being somebody who is highly sensitive, right? So the book is really for people who identify as sensitive souls. And I'm very much that. So there are 3 categories of people that I talk about, which you could be all 3 of these. You could just be 2, you could just be 1. And all 3 of them, I'll say also, it's not a binary yes or no, you're in it or you're not. It's the spectrum. So the extent to which you identify as a sensitive soul can really differ, and exactly how it looks for you can differ. But the 3 categories are highly sensitive people, empaths, and introverts. And so I think introverts, we may understand the most in terms of, people who prefer who get their energy from being alone, who like the quiet more than a lot of noise and a lot of activity, which is what you would experience at a typical protest. And as much as half of the population identifies as introvert, right? And then second is empaths. So empaths are folks who, I think the vast majority of humans feel some degree, we have the ability to feel some degree of empathy towards others. For empaths, it's almost like it's a superpower that we can't turn off. Like it's a radar that you just always have up. And everywhere you go, everything you encounter, you just kind of pick up on what's the vibe, what's the emotion. Almost anyone you encounter, you may kind of not only feel what they're feeling or have a very good sense of what they're feeling, but can be this way in which what they're feeling gets transferred to you, and you absorb it and you start to carry it. And so I think that is why something like a protest or some sort of social action in which there is a lot of anger or conflict, yelling, that could be really hard for somebody who's an empath, because then suddenly you're bombarded with all of these intense emotions that are not your own.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot to carry for one person. And then the last category are people who are highly sensitive. And this is something that I think we have developed our understanding more of just in the last 30 some years. Dr. Elaine Aron is a psychologist who's really led the research in this area. And highly sensitive people, they kind of live with this heightened experience of the world. So many of them, their actual senses, what they see, what they hear, what they feel, what they taste even, they experience it at a more intense level than your typical non-sensitive person. And so it will be the case, like if somebody is yelling through a bullhorn, a sensitive person will actually hear it as louder than a non-sensitive person. And so, so they are just more sensitive to this stimuli that's coming at them. And it is also often the case that highly sensitive people tend to be more emotionally sensitive. So we do tend to get our feelings hurt a little bit more, and we feel really, really deeply. If something happens, whether really good or really bad, we tend to ruminate on it a lot. We think about things. So deep feelers, deep thinkers, and there just is this level of intensity in which our inner world operates. And I'll say the wonderful thing about being a highly sensitive person, even though there are challenges that come with it, is that highly sensitive people, because of how deeply they feel, many of them are natural empaths, or it's very easy for them to connect to others. And so they have this deep heart and compassion for others. They are oftentimes drawn to help or to be with those who are suffering or who are having a hard time. They're very conscientious about what is not right in the world, because they have this innate ability just to notice, like, what is off, who's being left out, who's not being heard, what is unfair in our systems and processes. They notice it and they want to do something about it.
Yeah. So I'm curious, you mentioned that. How does that relate to, how can that really, I don't want to say be a challenge, but be a limitation when it comes to social activism? Because I'm thinking about, those intense feelings. Obviously the can't think here what I'm trying to say, but the audit, the noise and stuff, can't think of the word I'm trying to think of, but yeah, talk more about that. How can that really be a limitation when it comes to social activism?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is that the way we most often understand activism is that it is about protesting, marching, having these large events, shouting, debating, being in conflict, trying to win. And those all are things that tend to take a higher toll on sensitive people. And we generally do not like conflict. We do not like loud noises. We don't necessarily like huge crowds unless maybe it's a happy crowd, like at a concert or a game or something. And so part of what I'm trying to do with the book is to challenge us to expand our idea of what effective social activism looks like, that it doesn't have to involve those activities. It can. And again, as I said, there is very much a time and a place for those activities. But for us to effectively transform societies and communities to be more fair and equitable and loving, we can't just be shouting at each other. That only gets us so far. And so there are so many other ways that we can advocate for change from in approaches that do not require direct confrontation, do not require us to be shouting at others. And so I hope that anyone who encounters this book and who identifies as being sensitive in some way, that they can be encouraged to know that, hey, if you don't like that, if you don't like protesting and it's really hard for you, or if you don't like debating your friends on social media, that's okay. You don't have to do that. Other people can do that, and that's fine. But I would say, do what fits who you are.
Yeah.
And I would love it if we had more activists who actually advocated in a way that gave them joy and gave them life, instead of making them just feel really angry and discouraged.
Yeah. So let's dive into that a little bit more. In the book, you use two models to kind of differentiate what you call a warrior king model and then what you call a priestly model. I'm thinking of this especially in my context, as a pastor, knowing a lot of pastors, how there can be this external pressure often to be like this angry warrior king model. So just kind of define what those two are, and then we'll go from there.
So these models are taken from Dr. Elaine Aron. She writes about this in her seminal book, The Highly Sensitive Person, which I highly recommend for anybody who is interested in learning more about this personality trait. And so she takes these two models from ancient cultures where I think we kind of saw it more obviously. But the warrior king is the archetypical, strong, assertive leader who is very confident, has a bias toward action, getting stuff done, moving quickly, speaking loudly. And I think in the US and many Western cultures, we like that, right? As cultures, we think, that's what it is to be a leader. You got to be strong, you got to be loud, you got to be confident, and you got to act. The priestly advisors are the ones who are more thoughtful, are more contemplative, will take the time to plan, to get community input, to express caution, to want to ensure that we are making communal decisions, who will weigh the pros and cons, look at the unintended consequences of actions we may take. And so priestly advisors tend to have a much more relational approach to leadership. And I think just a thoughtful, and ultimately it is a slower form of leadership in terms of they will act, but they will take a lot more time to figure out how to act before doing so. And so what Dr. Aron says is that highly sensitive people are those priestly advisors. And not only that, but we are critical to the health of our communities and our societies. It is not a good thing to have everybody acting as a warrior king, making what can often be rash decisions, or, it can be a lot about winning and achieving, and showing what you've done. But we really need that balance of people who will call us back to, and don't forget about these people in the community, or don't forget about the costs that we may bear if we act too quickly. And so we need these priestly advisors because they are our conscience. They are our sources of wisdom, and they are our sources of community relationship.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I know, from my own experience, even thinking back, 2-3 years ago during that summer, there was this external pressure on, I know that was directed toward me of like, hey, you've got to do something. You've got to do something sooner. You got to do something quicker. And I was like, hey, I really feel like I haven't properly formed my thoughts. I really haven't feel like I've had the time and space to think about what is, what God wants me to say or what God wants me to do, right? How do you I think that's the challenge is there's so much external pressure because we're in such a quick, fast-paced context, like you say, to move fast, make mistakes.
Yeah.
What's your advice for, again, this is a podcast primarily for pastors and church leaders. Like for a pastor who's a highly sensitive person, and obviously as we're recording this with the more war and violence happening in the Middle East, I know that just from my experience, I know there'll be pastors who are going to get pressure and feel pressure, be like, I've got to say something on the conflict. And do you have a go-to response? Like, how do you create space for yourself to create space, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think it is so true and helpful just to name it, that those pressures are real, that they exist. And it's hard not to go along with what others are telling you. And I think especially in our world of social media, right? We've come to expect immediate responses from everybody. And I will say, I think, and I would hope most people agree with me, that I don't think that has served us well, right? Social media is
debatable at least, right?
A very clear example, right, of just people reacting, knee-jerk reactions left and right. And I think it has only driven us further apart.
Yeah.
And so what I would say, the conflict happening, all the violence that's been happening in the Middle East, as we're recording this, it has been weighing very heavily on me. I think that there is something to be said about at least acknowledging to your congregation what is going on, right? Because I have certainly been in church settings where you just carry on,
right?
Nothing has happened,
right?
And that doesn't serve people well when everyone can feel that shift of the world has fundamentally changed. We cannot ignore this. At the same time, I do not think that it requires us to have a stance, to have a fully formed opinion, to have a call to action right away. I mean, as you and I are talking, it's only been a few days.
Right.
And this is huge. And what is happening is in response to hundreds, if not thousands of years of history, right? And so to expect that within 24 hours, you would know exactly what to do and say, that doesn't really make sense to me, but I think it's absolutely appropriate to acknowledge it and to just create space for the emotion of it. I think in this particular context, in a lot of contexts related to social injustice, oftentimes I think the first and maybe most appropriate response is simply lament.
Yeah.
Lament that this is happening, lament at what we see humans doing to one another and to our planet. And I think that lament and crying out to God is always a good place to start.
Yeah, that's good. That's helpful.
And the action, the releasing of statements or whatever, that can all come later. But first, let's just mourn together for the loss of life, for the violence and the cruelty that we see being inflicted upon people, the ways in which hatred has driven people to unspeakable acts, and let's just pray.
Yeah. As someone, what am I trying to say here? I'm kind of a student of family systems theory, for those familiar. And I think about for me at least, my perspective is this kind of rush to anger. I think from my perspective can almost be a way of the emotion is too intense. So I need to find a way to like just dump out my emotion rather than process like, holy cow, what am I feeling right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I can imagine that. I think sometimes anger can feel like, at least for me, anger can feel, even though it's very intense, it can almost be like a safer emotion to go to because there's this protective sense. Right. You're like building this barrier around your heart and you're holding other people at a distance. And I'm just going to be mad and not let myself feel the other emotions of grief and sadness, which can be much harder to bear.
Yeah. So in the book, you state that anger is not an effective strategy for social change. And again, I think that would come as a shock or surprise to many in this current context where, like we've been talking about, anger drives so much. And I imagine you'd probably agree that in some context, anger is necessary.
Yes.
So where's that balance there?
Yes. I think that anger can be very appropriate. It's a very appropriate emotional response, especially when we see evil, when we see injustice, when we see, suffering happening that doesn't need to happen. And I think that it's necessary. We see Jesus getting angry at injustice in the Bible. It is very much, God's heart to be angry at what is unjust. I'll say also that anger has been found to be very effective in moving people toward action, right? It's an emotion that propels us forward. And so it can move people from a place of stasis or inertia to now I'm taking the first steps toward action. So oftentimes anger is where we start. And I get that. And oftentimes it makes a lot of sense. But I do believe that anger cannot be our long-term fuel. It cannot be where we continue to draw energy from as we pursue justice, as we try to right the wrongs around us. Because anger it's this like conflagration that just keeps growing and growing. And it's so hard to control once it gets to a certain point. In the book, I write about anger being like a blunt instrument. You get to the point where your anger becomes so big that you don't even notice when other people are being harmed by what you're saying and what you're doing because you're so focused on who or what you're angry at, so there can be a lot of collateral damage in the way that you conduct yourselves. And yet, you don't necessarily care because you're all about the anger, and I think anger can crowd out love and compassion. Anger can blind us to the humanity of other people and just turn them into our enemies, whether or not they really are. So I think that there's a lot of risk in holding on to anger for, beyond that kind of initial response. And honestly, anger takes a lot out of us as individuals. It causes a lot of stress. It will literally raise your blood pressure. It does all sorts of things to you to stay in that place of anger. And I do think that it breaks a lot of relationships. And for those of us who care deeply about communities and societies being more loving and equitable and inclusive, we should aim to be people who live as agents of love and compassion and not as agents of anger.
Yeah. So you're right that the activist ideal, and I'm thinking as I say those words, you're really, when you talk about the activist ideal, you're writing as someone who's just purely driven by anger can be another tool of division, oppression, and control. I heard this recently, and I wonder if this resonates. That for forgiveness is necessary because without forgiveness, or with forgiveness, action becomes justice. Without forgiveness, it becomes vengeance.
Mm-hmm.
Does that track?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that if we hold on to anger, we can use that as justification for all kinds of actions. We can easily turn into the same kind of people that we are protesting against. I think, as we're talking, right, there is this conflict blowing up in the Middle East, and it's been really discouraging to see the kind of responses. Again, I think a lot of it is people just having this instant reaction and not necessarily taking the time to think. But on both sides, right? So I think because of my background, I know people who are very conservative. I know people who are very progressive, and I see people celebrating the loss of life. I see people celebrating the death of children and the elderly.
Yeah.
I see people celebrating the destruction of entire communities on both sides of the border. And to me, I feel like if ever we find ourselves in a place where we are celebrating the death of another human being, something has happened in our heart that we need to take a really close look at. That even if, intellectually you are on the right side of history, in terms of your character and your heart, no, you're not there.
Yeah.
And real transformation is not going to happen if we cannot learn to embrace those that we disagree with, to those that we've argued with, to those who have harmed us. It's extremely difficult, which is why nobody's lining up to forgive all their enemies. And certainly, I'm not saying you have to physically embrace somebody if they are unsafe and toxic and wanting to cause you harm. But yes, that ability to forgive, to kind of release that power of anger and vengeance that they might hold over you. There is a freedom in that, and it frees us to love more deeply and openly, and to hold to the promises of God, that He is the ultimate judge, and that in His time all things will be made right.
Yeah. There's a lot more questions I want to ask here, but for sake of time, let me ask one more question here before we take a break. Related to, I think, but something separate you wrote in the book. You write that resiliency is about staying true to your calling, not necessarily keeping it together. And I imagine over the last few years, there's been many pastors and leaders and frankly, just people who have felt like everything's fallen apart for them. Talk more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, so I think the risk of burnout for anybody in a form of work, ministry, vocation that involves giving, serving, advocating, the risk of burnout is extremely high. I know we've had very high rates of burnout among pastors and ministry leaders in the last few years, among nonprofit workers, social justice advocates. The rates of burnout are always high. I think, one study found that at least half of nonprofit professionals are burning out at any point in time. right? And I wouldn't be surprised if it was a similar figure for pastors and those in ministry. And so this question of resilience is a big one. And for many, many years, my assumption of what it meant to be resilient was the sense of, well, I just gotta, as soon as something happens, I just need to pick myself up, dust myself off, and move on. It's that ideal of I'm just going to bounce back, brush it off, and pretend like nothing happened. And there actually are some people in the world who can do that,
Right.
and kudos to them. My husband is one of them, and I so admire his ability to do that. And that is not me. It just simply isn't. As hard as I've tried over the last 20 plus years to be that kind of person, it's not me. And it's just how I'm wired. It's not something I can change. And so it was very discouraging to think like, well, I guess it's just impossible for me to be resilient. But as I delved more deeply into this topic, I realized that that there's a different definition of resilience that a lot of psychologists use and other social scientists as well use. And that resilience is more about knowing who you are and staying true to your purpose, regardless of what happens. So it doesn't mean that you don't get hurt, that you don't get tired, that you don't get bruised and battered and need to lick your wounds. It just means that, the waves will come, the people will challenge you, conflict will happen, challenges will arise. And in the midst of all of that, can you still hold on to your identity? To your understanding of this is who I am, for those of us who are Christian, like holding on to our belovedness and this idea that no matter what happens, I am still a child of God. And this sense of purpose, that I have a place in the kingdom of God. I have a calling in the kingdom of God. And that idea of resilience, I love it because I feel like that's within reach of everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
No matter your temperament or, how your brain is wired. And there are a lot of practices that probably many of us already do, but, we can continue to do to remind ourselves of who we are and our purpose, even when things get really hard. And if you can hold on to that, that will help see you through a lot of challenges. And of course, you may need to take breaks. You may need to get some therapy. You may need to adapt how you work or maybe even change the environment that you're working in. But I think in terms of what helps you to continue to move forward is that sense of, I still know who I am, and I still believe that this path I'm on is my purpose.
Yeah. Well, there's so much more we could talk about. We need to take a quick break here. But again, the book is Social Justice for the Sensitive Soul, How to Change the World in Quiet Ways. Highly recommend this for any pastor or leader or, nonprofit worker who is highly sensitive, an introvert like me or, highly sensitive empath. So let's take a quick break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Dorcas Cheng-Tozun. So thanks so much for the conversation. Appreciate your time and your thoughts. Closing questions, I always welcome folks to take these as seriously or not as you'd like. Also to think metaphorically of them if you'd like. So if you're Pope for a day, what might that day look like for you? What you want to do?
So in my ideal world, if I were Pope for a day, I would love to declare a day of jubilee.
There you go.
Like what we see in scripture, a day of celebration and rest, where there is the forgiveness of debts and the giving back of what has been taken, and that those who have much would give to those who have less. And I know that would be so hard for people that I don't think I would last as Pope for more than 1 or 2 hours. but that is what I would love to do if I could.
Pope for 2 hours. We can live with that. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life.
Because of the exposure that I've been getting to contemplative spirituality, I am really interested in learning more about and from Howard Thurman,
Mm-hmm.
who was a theologian during the civil rights movement, who, as far as I can tell, the term highly sensitive person didn't exist during Thurman's day.
Mm-hmm.
But he seems to be a highly sensitive person in that he intentionally chose not to participate in the protests and the marches of the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a pastor. He wrote a lot. He was a spiritual advisor, very influential spiritual advisor to Dr. King and many others within the civil rights movement. And I think he just has so much wisdom to offer, I think, especially now with everything going on in our world. I would just love to hear from him of how are we as Christians, as the church, to respond in the face of so much inequality and so much violence.
Yeah. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I think that it's almost like there's two stories happening simultaneously right now, right? There is this incredible technological progress that we're seeing, right? And the world has never had more knowledge and wealth and technological ability. And at the same time, these like age-old human tragedies continue to happen over and over again, right? Hunger, poverty, inequality, the refugee crisis that, has been peaking for years now, like the greatest number of refugees that we've ever seen in the world. The wars currently happening, the conflicts, the ethnic violence, the religious violence. And so I think that people will look back on this time period and really question, with all the resources that we had at our disposal, how did we choose to use that? How did we respond to the greatest human needs of our day? And so far, I would say our track record is only so-so. There are some good things happening, but there's still a lot more to be done.
I just want to reflect there real quick on what you said, that this way of being is not just to put your head in the sand. Like, it's clear just from what you said, if I can reflect back to you, that you're someone who deeply cares about and feels the brokenness in our world. So for our broader listeners who, if someone's like listening out there like, boy, I'm pretty skeptical of this whole thing. It sounds just like putting my head in the sand or pretending tragedy and violence and oppression doesn't exist. Like, that's not the case.
Oh, not at all. Yes. So we haven't even talked about the last, third or half of my book, which is all about finding pathways toward activism that work for people who identify as being sensitive souls. Many of us are going to be drawn to this kind of work and activism and volunteerism, and that is a wonderful thing, and you should totally listen to that nudging within you. And my encouragement is just to find a way to do it that represents who you truly authentically are, that you don't need to bend yourself into, contort yourself into strange shapes to try to fit the mold of what other people tell you that an activist needs to look like. You can be an activist as an academic. I have a whole chapter on the power of research and data and information. I have a whole chapter on the incredible influence that engineers and product designers and inventors can have in terms of creating technologies that promote more equality or that help solve some of our most pressing challenges. You can simply be a really good neighbor and friend who is having meaningful conversations with the people around you. And research has shown that loving, meaningful, face-to-face conversations, one-on-one with people, are a very effective vehicle for change, for people to set aside their prejudices and their biases, that is much more effective than yelling at someone through social media or, yelling at them as you're marching in the street.
Right.
So not only are these approaches that maybe would be a little bit more comfortable for somebody who is highly sensitive, but they're actually incredibly effective.
Yeah.
They have been shown. And so I have examples throughout my book. There's more than 100 different activists I talk about in my book who have been pursuing justice in these kind of unconventional ways that has been incredibly effective. And we can continue to do that today.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that thing about relational activism. Didn't have time to ask you about that, but very worthy of conversation. So appreciate you mentioning that. So just tell us real quick where people can connect with you, find out more information, get the book, all that stuff.
Yes. So I am online, though you will notice that I try to be very careful in what I say on social media, because I have found that is not a super healthy place for me, and probably for many others. But I am there, and you can certainly reach me. My handle is Chang-Tozun on Facebook and Instagram, and LinkedIn are the main ones that I use. I also have a website, changtozun.com. You can contact me through there or read more about this book or the other books that I've written. You can certainly Google me. The nice thing about having an unusual name is there's only one of me in the world. So if you Google me, you'll find lots of things that I've written and done over the years. But yeah, I love hearing from folks. So please feel free to reach out. And the book is available certainly through, the main retailers. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on Barnes & Noble. You can get it through independent bookstores. So wherever you would like to get your books. And it's available as a hard copy, but also as an audiobook and an ebook.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing again. For our listeners, I highly recommend the book. So I always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.